Sometimes the smallest act of human decency can shatter a father's world and then rebuild it into something more beautiful than he ever imagined. When single father Henry Gomez noticed a boy sitting completely alone at his daughter's elementary school graduation, separated by dozens of empty chairs from the nearest family, he made a choice that would expose a billionaire's deepest shame and transform two families forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Riverside Academy graduation ceremony was supposed to be a celebration. Parents filled the pristine auditorium in their finest clothes, phones ready to capture their children crossing the stage into middle school. The private elementary school's reputation attracted families who measured success in stock portfolios and vacation homes, where achievement was expected and mediocrity was simply not an option. But in Section C, row 15, one seat told a different story entirely. 10-year-old Brian Jordan sat perfectly upright in his pressed navy suit, hands folded precisely in his lap, staring straight ahead at the empty stage. His posture was impeccable, the result of years of behavioral therapy and social coaching that cost more than most families' annual income. But his complete isolation in a sea of celebratory families revealed a truth that no amount of money could fix. He was utterly, devastatingly alone. Brian's autism had always made social connections challenging, but today it felt like a spotlight illuminating everything his mother had failed to provide. While other fifth-grade graduates were surrounded by grandparents, siblings, cousins, and family friends who'd watched them grow up, Brian had no one. The carefully maintained empty buffer zone around him spoke volumes about a family that had chosen reputation over relationship, image over intimacy. 3 sections away, Henry Gomez adjusted the collar of his daughter's graduation gown and tried not to calculate how many extra shifts at the construction site this private school tuition had cost him. At 38, Henry had the kind of quiet strength that came from raising a brilliant daughter on a contractor salary, while his ex-wife contributed nothing but broken promises and missed birthdays. His daughter, 11-year-old Lily Gomez, was graduating as valedictorian, an achievement that represented 5 years of Henry working double shifts, skipping meals, and choosing between groceries and gasoline more times than he cared to remember. But seeing Lily's face glowing with pride as she adjusted her Honor Society pin made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Mom, look over there," Lily whispered, nodding discreetly toward Brian's section. "That boy has been sitting alone this entire time. Where's his family?" Henry followed his daughter's gaze and felt his heart clench. In all his years of struggling to provide for Lily, he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit into the world of privilege and plenty that surrounded his daughter's education. But he'd never seen isolation quite this stark, this deliberate. The boy, he could see now that he was probably on the autism spectrum, recognizing the telltale signs from his work at the Children's Hospital construction projects, sat with the kind of rigid composure that suggested he'd been taught to make himself as invisible as possible. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was utterly, devastatingly alone in what should have been one of his proudest moments. "Maybe his parents are running late," Henry suggested, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The ceremony had started 45 minutes ago. No parent misses their child's elementary graduation unless they chose not to be there. Around Brian, other families chatted quietly, sharing programs and pointing out their graduates in the lineup. Grandmothers dabbed at tears with tissues. Fathers adjusted camera settings for the perfect shot. Younger siblings fidgeted in their dress-up clothes, already bored, but present because family meant showing up for each other's important moments. Brian remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the stage, as if he'd learned that looking around only highlighted what he didn't have. The first graduate's name was called, and the auditorium erupted in cheers from Section A. An entire row of people, parents, grandparents, what looked like aunts and uncles, stood up whooping and applauding as Ashley Martinez crossed the stage. Their joy was infectious, spreading to nearby families who smiled and applauded, even though they didn't know Ashley personally. When the second name was announced, Section F exploded with celebration. A father let out a whistle so loud it echoed through the entire auditorium, while a mother held up a hand-painted sign reading, "That's our boy," in glittering letters. Henry watched Brian's shoulders tense slightly with each family celebration, and he realized the boy was bracing himself for his own moment, the moment when his name would be called, and the auditorium would fall into polite, scattered applause because there was no one there who belonged to him. "I can't stand this," Lily whispered, and Henry could hear tears threatening her daughter's voice. "Mom, we have to do something." Before Henry could respond, he found himself standing up. His construction work had taught him to recognize when someone needed help, even if they couldn't ask for it. He'd spent years looking out for the new guys on job sites, speaking up for workers who had no one else in their corner. This felt exactly the same. "Excuse me," he said softly to the families in her row as she stepped past them. "I'll be right back." Henry walked down the aisle with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. He could feel curious eyes following his progress, but he kept his focus on the boy who was about to experience one of the most important moments of his life in complete solitude. When he reached Brian's row, he paused at the end, close enough to see the fine tremor in the boy's hands and the way he kept his breathing carefully controlled. Up close, he could see that Brian was actually quite a handsome child. Dark hair perfectly styled, intelligent eyes behind expensive glasses. The kind of face that belonged in school brochures or family Christmas cards. "Hi," he said gently, his voice pitched to be heard over the ongoing ceremony, but soft enough not to startle the boy. "I'm Henry Gomez. My daughter Lily is graduating today too." Brian's eyes shifted toward her with the cautious movement of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. He nodded once, a precise acknowledgement that revealed years of social skills training. "I noticed you're sitting by yourself," Henry continued, settling into the empty chair beside him without asking permission. "Would you mind if I sat with you? No one should have to experience their graduation alone, and honestly, I think I'd enjoy the company too." For a moment, Brian said nothing, and Henry wondered if he'd misread the situation entirely. Maybe the boy preferred to be alone. Maybe he was intruding on some family drama he didn't understand. Maybe. "I would like that very much," Brian said quietly, his voice carrying the careful diction of someone who'd worked hard to communicate clearly. "Thank you for asking." As Henry settled into the chair beside Brian Jordan, she had no idea that her simple act of motherly kindness had just set in motion a chain of events that would reveal the shocking truth about one of the most powerful families in the city, expose a billionaire's greatest regret, and prove that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect to find us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weight of Brian Jordan's silence told Henry Gomez everything he needed to know about wealth, privilege, and the kind of loneliness that money couldn't fix. As he settled into the chair beside the 10-year-old boy, Henry couldn't help but notice the details that painted a picture of a family that had everything except what mattered most. Brian's navy suit was perfectly tailored, the kind of custom clothing that cost more than Henry made in a month of construction work. His leather shoes were polished to a mirror shine, his hair professionally styled in a way that suggested regular visits to an expensive salon. Even his posture spoke of years of etiquette lessons and behavioral coaching. But beneath all that expensive perfection, Henry recognized something achingly familiar. A child who had learned to make himself small in a world that found him inconvenient. "My mom couldn't come today," Brian said quietly, his words carefully measured in the way of children who'd been taught that every statement needed to be considered before speaking. "She had an important board meeting that couldn't be rescheduled." Henry felt his jaw clench at the casual way Brian delivered this devastating information. An important board meeting on the day her 10-year-old son graduated from elementary school. The boy's matter-of-fact tone suggested this wasn't the first time work had taken precedence over his milestones. "I'm sorry to hear that," Henry said gently. "Board meetings must be pretty serious business." "Mom says they are. She's the CEO of North Star Technologies. They make software for hospitals and medical devices. They employ over 12,000 people, so her time is very valuable." North Star Technologies. Henry had heard of the company, impossible not to, when their logo appeared on half the medical equipment he'd helped install during hospital construction projects. The CEO was reportedly one of the wealthiest women in the country, a tech genius who'd built her empire from nothing and now commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. And apparently, she was too busy running that empire to watch her son graduate. "That sounds like important work," Henry acknowledged. "But I bet she wishes she could be here with you." Brian's shrug spoke volumes. "She said she'd try to make it, but something always comes up. It's okay. I'm used to it." 10 years old and already resigned to being an afterthought in his mother's life. Henry thought about his own relationship with Lily, how he'd moved heaven and earth to make sure he never missed a single school play, soccer game, or parent-teacher conference. He'd taken unpaid days, switched shifts with coworkers, even walked out on job sites when the choice was between overtime pay and being present for his daughter. The idea of missing her graduation for any reason was unthinkable. "What about your dad?" Henry asked carefully. "I don't have one," Brian replied, with the same matter-of-fact tone. "Mom says she didn't need a husband to have me, just good genetics and a reliable sperm donor. She picked him from a catalog." The clinical way Brian discussed his conception made Henry's heart ache. This child had been planned, wanted, created with intention, and yet here he sat, alone in a room full of celebrating families, talking about his father like he was a medical procedure rather than half of his genetic identity. Across the auditorium, Henry caught sight of Lily waving at him from her spot in the graduation lineup. Lily's face was radiant with joy, not just for her own achievement, but because she knew her father was watching. She'd grown up knowing that no matter what challenges they faced financially, she was the most important person in Henry's world. The contrast with Brian's situation couldn't have been more stark.
"Tell me about yourself, Brian," Henry said, determined to focus on the boy rather than dwelling on his absent mother. "What do you like to do? What are you good at?" For the first time, Brian's carefully controlled expression brightened slightly. "I'm really good at math, and I like patterns, in numbers, in music, in the way buildings are designed. I can usually figure out the mathematical principles behind architectural structures just by looking at them." Henry raised an eyebrows, genuinely impressed. "That's incredible. I work in construction, and I can tell you that most adults don't understand the math that goes into building design." "Really?" Brian's eyes lit up with the first genuine enthusiasm Henry had seen from him. "What kind of buildings do you work on?" "All kinds. Hospitals, schools, office buildings. We just finished a pediatric wing at Children's Medical Center downtown. Took us 8 months, but it was worth it, knowing it would help sick kids get better. I've been to Children's Medical Center, Brian said quietly, for my autism evaluations and therapy sessions. It's a beautiful building. Did you work on the sensory-friendly waiting areas? They have these amazing light panels that change colors in mathematical sequences. The connection hit Henry like a physical blow. This brilliant, lonely child had spent time in the very building Henry had helped construct, probably undergoing evaluations and treatments while his mother attended board meetings. The irony was almost too painful to process. I helped install those light systems. We worked with occupational therapists to make sure they'd be calming for kids with sensory processing needs. Brian's face transformed completely. Gone was the careful, controlled expression he'd worn like armor. In its place was pure wonder, the look of a child who'd discovered an unexpected connection to something meaningful in his life. "You help make that space safe for kids like me?" Brian asked, his voice filled with awe. "We all did. The whole construction crew knew how important that project was. Every single person who worked on that building cared about making it perfect for the children who would use it." For a moment, Brian was speechless. I could see him processing this information, this revelation that the man who'd chosen to sit with him at graduation had actually helped create one of the few places in his world where he felt understood and accepted. The ceremony continued around them, but Henry found himself completely focused on this remarkable child who'd been raised in luxury but starved of the one thing no amount of money could provide: genuine human connection. Brian's autism was the first problem in Victoria's life that money and determination couldn't fix. She'd hired the best specialists, enrolled him in the most exclusive programs, provided every possible resource and accommodation, but she couldn't reprogram her own brain to understand his, couldn't debug the communication barriers between them, couldn't optimize their relationship like she would a struggling software platform. So she did what she had always done when faced with challenges she couldn't solve. She worked harder, earned more, built bigger. She told herself that providing financial security was love, that ensuring Brian's future was more important than being present for his childhood. But deep down, she knew the truth she was too afraid to admit. She was failing at the only job that truly mattered. Back in the auditorium, Henry watched Brian's careful facade crack slightly as he talked about his interests, his therapy, his experiences navigating a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. This boy wasn't just intelligent, he was extraordinary, and he was wasting away in a life filled with everything except love. As the first graduate's name was called and the auditorium erupted in celebration, Henry made a silent promise to the child beside him. Today, Brian Jordan wouldn't graduate alone. Today, someone would cheer for him like he mattered, like his achievements deserved recognition, like he was worthy of celebration. Henry had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would expose one of the country's most successful CEOs as a mother who had lost sight of what success actually meant. He didn't know that Brian's mysterious absences from school, his expensive therapies, his carefully crafted schedule were all managed by a woman who commanded billions but couldn't figure out how to connect with her own son. All Henry knew was that no child should face their proudest moments alone, and he had the power to change that for at least one boy on at least one day. The revolution would start with applause. What Henry Gomez didn't know was that his simple act of sitting beside Brian Jordan was being watched by more than just curious parents in the auditorium. 3 rows behind them, Amanda Chen held her phone steady as she recorded what she later described as the most beautiful moment of human kindness I've ever witnessed.
Amanda had originally started filming to capture her own son's graduation, but something about the scene unfolding in Section C caught her attention.
She watched through her phone screen as a working-class father. She could tell from his weathered hands and the way he'd carefully pressed his one good shirt, chose to leave his own family section to sit with a boy who was obviously struggling with being alone. "Mom, are you still recording Tommy?" her 8-year-old daughter whispered. "Shh, sweetheart, I'm capturing something special," Amanda replied, adjusting her angle to better frame the unlikely pair. Through her lens, she could see Brian's transformation. The rigid, defensive posture he'd maintained throughout the ceremony was gradually softening as Henry spoke to him. The boy's hands, which had been clenched in his lap, were now gesturing slightly as he explained something with growing animation. Most remarkably, Brian was actually smiling. Not the practiced, polite expression she'd seen him wear at school events, but a genuine, unguarded moment of joy. When Brian's name was called, Brian Michael Jordan, graduating with highest honors in mathematics and science, Amanda watched Henry leap to his feet like he was celebrating his own son. The construction worker's booming voice cut through the auditorium as he shouted, "That's my boy! Way to go, Brian!" His applause was thunderous, enthusiastic, completely unself-conscious. Brian's face as he walked across the stage was radiant. For the first time in the 3 years Amanda had observed him at various school functions, the boy looked genuinely happy. He actually waved at Henry from the stage, a spontaneous gesture that brought tears to Amanda's eyes. "Did you get that, Mom?" her 8-year-old daughter asked, pointing toward the stage. "That man is crying because he's so proud of that boy." Amanda looked at her phone screen and realized she'd been recording for nearly 20 minutes. What had started as casual documentation of her son's graduation had become something entirely different, a testament to the power of showing up for someone who needed it most. That evening, Amanda uploaded the video to her Instagram account with the caption, "Sometimes angels don't have wings, they just have hearts big enough to see a child who needs them." This man left his own family section to sit with a boy who was graduating alone. The pure joy on that child's face when someone finally cheered for him will stay with me forever. This is what humanity looks like. #graduation, #kindness, #autism, #heroes, #bekind. By morning, the video had 50,000 views. By the following evening, it had crossed the million-view threshold. By the end of the week, Amanda's 20-minute recording had been viewed over 15 million times across multiple platforms as people shared, commented, and tagged friends who needed to see this moment of unexpected grace. The comments poured in from around the world. "This made me sob at my desk. What an incredible man! My son has autism, and I dream of someone showing him this kind of acceptance. Beautiful. Faith in humanity restored. We need more people like this, Dad. I'm not crying, you're crying. Actually, we're all crying, and that's okay. This is what it means to see a child who needs you and just show up." The video was translated into dozens of languages. International news outlets picked it up. Parenting blogs analyzed it. Autism advocacy groups shared it as an example of inclusion and acceptance. #Brian and Henry began trending on social media platforms worldwide. What made the video particularly powerful wasn't just the act of kindness. It was the visible transformation in both individuals. Viewers could see Henry's natural warmth drawing out Brian's hidden personality, could witness the exact moment when a lonely child realized he mattered to someone. The authenticity was undeniable, the emotion raw and real. Celebrity shares amplified the reach exponentially. Ellen DeGeneres reposted it with the comment, "This is why we need more Henrys in the world." Oprah shared it on her Instagram story. The video appeared on late-night television shows, morning news programs, and international broadcasts. But the most impactful shares came from parents of children with autism, special education teachers, and advocates for inclusion.
They recognized something profound in the footage, not just a moment of kindness, but a demonstration of how simple human connection could transform a child's world. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric psychologist specializing in autism, was quoted in a viral twit thread. "What you're seeing here isn't just niceness, it's therapeutic intervention in action. This child's stress response visibly decreases throughout the interaction. His stimming behaviors calm, his posture relaxes, his facial expressions become more animated. One person's genuine attention accomplished what months of therapy sessions aimed to achieve." The video spawned countless discussion threads about inclusion, parenting, community responsibility, and the ways small actions create ripple effects. Parents shared their own stories of times strangers had shown kindness to their children. Teachers talked about the students who needed extra support. Community members began organizing inclusion initiatives at local schools. Amanda Chen found herself thrust into an unexpected role as the documentarian of a moment that had touched millions. Interview requests flooded her inbox. News stations wanted to speak with her about what she'd witnessed, but Amanda consistently redirected attention to the real story: the man who'd shown up for a child who needed him, and the boy whose joy had reminded the world what unconditional acceptance looked like. "I just happened to be recording," she told the CNN interviewer. "The real heroes are Henry Gomez, who saw a child in need and acted without hesitation, and Brian Jordan, who trusted a stranger's kindness. They created something beautiful together, and I'm just grateful I was there to capture it."
Meanwhile, Henry remained completely unaware of his internet fame. He didn't have social media accounts, rarely used his old flip phone for anything beyond work calls, and was too busy with double shifts and single parenting to notice that his face was appearing on news websites around the globe. His coworkers at the construction site had started getting friend requests from strangers, but nobody connected it to Henry's simple act of kindness at his daughter's graduation. Brian was equally oblivious to the attention their moment had generated. His limited internet access was carefully monitored and filtered, designed to protect him from overstimulation and inappropriate content. He spent the days following graduation replaying his conversation with Henry, treasuring the memory of someone genuinely caring about his interests and achievements. But in a Manhattan penthouse office, Victoria Sterling was about to receive news that would force her to confront the consequences of her absence in ways she never could have imagined. Her head of security had been monitoring social media mentions of her son's name, a standard protective measure for the family of a high-profile CEO. The alert that came through on that Wednesday morning would shatter her carefully constructed world and force her to see her son through the eyes of 15 million strangers. The video that was making her son famous wasn't showcasing his academic achievements, his expensive education, or his privileged lifestyle. It was celebrating the moment a working-class stranger had given Brian what she, despite all her resources and success, had failed to provide: the simple gift of being seen, valued, and cheered for exactly as he was. As the view count continued climbing and the comments kept flowing, one truth became undeniably clear to millions of viewers around the world. Sometimes the most profound acts of love come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never thought to look for. The revolution had, indeed, started with applause, and now it was spreading across the globe, one share at a time. The first gift arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after graduation. Henry was rushing to get Lily ready for summer day camp when he found the envelope wedged under his apartment door, thick, cream-colored paper with his name written in elegant script across the front. No return address, no postmark, just Henry Gomez in handwriting that spoke of expensive education and careful penmanship. Inside was a gift card to Riverside Academy's summer enrichment program. Not just any gift card, one worth $3,000, enough to cover Lily's entire summer session, including field trips, supplies, and the advanced mathematics course she'd been begging to take but Henry couldn't afford on his construction salary. "Dad, look at this," Lily breathed, reading over his shoulder. "It's for the robotics camp in the junior engineering program. That's exactly what I wanted to do this summer."
Henry turned the card over in his weathered hands, searching for some clue about its origin. The gift card was legitimate. He recognized the official Riverside Academy logo and security features, but there was no explanation, no note, nothing to indicate who might have sent such an extravagant gift or why. "Maybe it's from the school?" Lily suggested hopefully. "Like a scholarship or something?" But Henry knew better. Riverside Academy didn't hand out $3,000 scholarships without applications, interviews, and months of bureaucratic processing. This was something else entirely, something that felt both wonderful and unsettling in equal measure. He called the school's administrative office during his lunch break, expecting to clear up the mystery quickly. Instead, he found himself speaking with Mrs. Patterson, the enrollment coordinator, who seemed genuinely puzzled by his inquiry. "Mr. Gomez, I'm showing that Lily's summer program tuition was paid in full yesterday through our online portal. We have several wealthy families who prefer to help other children without recognition. The donor specifically requested that Lily be enrolled in our advanced STEM track." Advanced STEM track? That costs more than $3,000. Actually, the donation covered the full premium program, $4,500 total, plus an additional $500 credit for supplies and field trips. Whoever made this donation was very thorough in ensuring Lily would have everything she needs. Henry sank onto a stack of lumber at the construction site, his head spinning. Nearly $5,000. That was more than he typically earned in 2 months after taxes and living expenses. Someone had not only paid for his daughter's summer enrichment, but had upgraded her to the most expensive program available. "Do you have any information about the donor? I'd like to thank them." "I'm sorry, Mr. Gomez. Our anonymous donor system is designed to protect privacy. I can tell you that the payment was legitimate and that whoever made it specifically mentioned wanting to support exceptional students from working families. Lily's graduation performance clearly impressed someone." The second gift appeared 3 days later, this time at the construction site. Henry's foreman, Jake Rodriguez, approached him during the afternoon break with a confused expression and an official-looking document in his hands. "Gomez, you got some kind of legal paperwork delivered here today," Jake said, handing over a manila envelope marked "Confidential, Henry Gomez." "Courier said it had to be delivered to you personally, wouldn't leave it with anyone else." Henry opened the envelope with dirt-stained fingers, expecting some kind of bureaucratic nonsense, maybe something related to his divorce settlement or Lily's school records. Instead, he found himself staring at a scholarship award letter from the International Union of Construction Workers Education Foundation. "The IUCW Emergency Family Support Scholarship," he read aloud. "Awarded to Henry Gomez in recognition of outstanding community service and dedication to family values. Award amount, $10,000, to be distributed over 6 months for educational and emergency expenses." Jake whistled low under his breath. 10 grand? I've been in this union for 20 years and never heard of that scholarship. When did you apply for it? "I didn't," Henry said, scanning the official letterhead and signatures. "I've never even heard of this foundation." The letter included contact information for a law firm in downtown Seattle, Morrison, Blackwell and Associates, with instructions to call within 48 hours to arrange payment distribution. Henry stared at the phone number, his mind racing. First, the summer program, now a $10,000 scholarship from an organization he'd never applied to. The timing was too perfect, too convenient, too specifically tailored to his needs. That evening, after tucking Lily into bed, Henry sat at his kitchen table surrounded by the mysterious gifts and tried to make sense of what was happening. The graduation ceremony had been exactly 1 week ago. Brian's face flashed in his memory, the boy's genuine smile when Henry had cheered for him, the way he'd lit up talking about mathematical patterns and building design. Could this somehow be connected to that moment? Had someone at the graduation ceremony been so moved by his simple act of kindness that they decided to help his family? It seemed impossible, but Henry couldn't think of any other explanation for the sudden windfall. He called the law firm the next morning,
reaching a receptionist who seemed to be expecting his call. "Mr. Gomez, yes, we've been handling the scholarship distribution. The donor has requested complete anonymity, but I can schedule you to meet with one of our associates to discuss the payment structure and tax implications." "Can you at least tell me what community service this is referring to? The letter mentions outstanding community service, but I haven't done anything special." There was a pause, then the sound of paper shuffling. The donor's notes mention demonstrated compassion toward children with special needs and exemplary character in supporting vulnerable community members. Does that help clarify things? Henry's heart stopped. Children with special needs. Brian's autism, his isolation at the graduation ceremony, the way Henry had instinctively recognized the boy's need for connection and support. Someone had been watching that day, had seen his interaction with Brian, had decided it warranted this extraordinary generosity. But who? And why such incredible amounts of money? The scholarship alone represented more than 6 months of his income. Combined with Lily's summer program, someone had invested nearly $15,000 in his family based on a 20-minute conversation with a lonely child. The third intervention arrived that weekend in the form of a phone call from Lily's pediatrician. Dr. Sarah Kim had been treating Lily since she was a toddler, helping manage the mild asthma that occasionally flared up during Seattle's humid summers. Henry had been putting off Lily's annual checkup due to cost. His insurance covered the basics, but the comprehensive testing Dr. Kim recommended was expensive. "Mr. Gomez, I wanted to let you know that someone has established a medical account for Lily. It covers all her preventative care, specialist consultations, and any emergency treatments she might need. The payment came through a medical foundation, the Children's Health Security Initiative. I've never worked with them before, but their credentials are impeccable. The foundation specifically requested that we provide Lily with the gold standard pediatric care package, including nutritional counseling, mental health support, and educational assessments." Another anonymous foundation. Another perfectly timed intervention addressing needs Henry had been worrying about but couldn't afford to address. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Someone with significant resources was quietly, systematically ensuring that his family's basic needs were not just met, but exceeded. That night, Henry stood on his apartment balcony, looking out over the Seattle skyline, and tried to process what was happening to his life. In 1 week, mysterious benefactors had invested what amounts to a year of his salary in his family's future. Lily would have the summer enrichment she deserved. He would have emergency funds to fall back on, and his daughter's health would be protected regardless of what insurance covered. It should have felt like winning the lottery. Instead, it felt like being watched, studied, evaluated by someone who had resources beyond his imagination and reasons he couldn't begin to understand. The gifts were generous beyond belief, but they also raised questions that kept him awake at night. Who had that kind of money to spend anonymously? Who would invest so heavily in a construction worker's family based on a single act of kindness? And most importantly, what did they want in return? As the city lights twinkled below him, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn towards something much larger and more complicated than he was prepared to handle. The mysterious benefactor wasn't finished with him yet. He could sense it in the careful planning, the perfect timing, the way each gift addressed needs he'd barely admitted to himself. Someone was watching, someone was planning, and Henry Gomez was about to discover that sometimes guardian angels came with agendas that were far more complex than simple charity. The phone call that would change everything came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Brian's graduation. Henry was already dressed for work, nursing his first cup of coffee and mentally preparing for another day of framing walls at the new medical complex downtown, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize.
"Mr. Gomez?" This is Patricia Hendricks from Caldwell Morrison and Associates. I apologize for calling so early, but I have some time-sensitive information regarding your family's situation. Henry's stomach dropped. In his experience, early morning calls from law firms meant bad news. Collection agencies, legal problems, complications with his divorce settlement. What kind of situation? The positive kind, I assure you. Patricia's voice was warm, professional, tinged with what sounded like genuine excitement. Mr. Gomez, I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected as the recipient of the Pacific Northwest Working Families Foundation's inaugural Family Transformation Grant. The award amount is $150,000 to be distributed immediately. The coffee mug slipped from Henry's hand, shattering against the kitchen floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. $150,000. The number was so large it didn't seem real, didn't fit into the mathematical reality of his world where he calculated expenses in terms of overtime hours and skipped meals. "I'm sorry, what foundation?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Pacific Northwest Working Families Foundation. It's a new charitable organization focused on supporting exceptional single parents who demonstrate outstanding character and community service. Your application was reviewed by our board, and they were unanimous in their decision to award you the full grant amount." "But I never submitted an application." Henry sank into his kitchen chair, staring at the broken mug pieces scattered across the linoleum. A community nominator. Someone had been watching him closely enough to know his financial struggles, his custody arrangement, his work schedule. Someone had taken the time to document his life in enough detail to convince a foundation to award him more money than he'd ever imagined having. The grant comes with some specific stipulations. $25,000 is designated for immediate family expenses, housing, utilities, food, transportation. Another $25,000 is earmarked for your daughter's educational fund. $50,000 is allocated for home purchase assistance, should you choose to buy rather than rent. The remaining $50,000 is for your own educational or professional development. Henry's head was spinning. They thought of everything, every financial stress he faced, every dream he'd put on hold, every opportunity he wanted to provide for Lily but couldn't afford. Whoever had nominated him knew his life with an intimacy that was both generous and unsettling. "There's also a separate component," Patricia added. "The foundation has partnered with Seattle Community College to offer you a full scholarship for their construction management degree program. Classes would be scheduled around your work hours, and the program includes internship opportunities with major development firms in the area." A degree? Henry had dreamed of going back to school since high school, but life had intervened. First with early marriage, then with Lily's arrival, then with the divorce and single parenthood. The idea of actually earning a degree, of moving beyond manual labor into project management, had seemed impossible given his circumstances. "I don't understand why," he began. "Mr. Gomez, may I read you a portion of your nominator's statement? I think it might help explain the foundation's decision." Henry nodded, though she couldn't see him, his throat too tight to speak. "This man embodies everything our society should value: genuine compassion, selfless service, and the kind of moral character that changes lives through simple acts of human decency. When he saw a child in need, he didn't calculate the social cost or consider his own convenience. He simply acted with the instinctive kindness that makes communities stronger and children safer. His own struggles have not hardened his heart, but have instead deepened his capacity for empathy. He deserves support not because he asks for it, but because he gives it freely to others who need it most." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Someone had seen his interaction with Brian and understood it in ways he hadn't understood it himself. They'd recognized something in that moment that Henry had simply considered basic human decency, the natural response of any parent who saw a child sitting alone. "Your nominator also included several character references from co-workers, neighbors, and parents from your daughter's school.
The picture that emerged was of someone who consistently goes above and beyond for others, often at personal cost. The foundation was particularly moved by accounts of you volunteering your construction skills for community projects, helping elderly neighbors with home repairs, and coaching youth soccer despite your demanding work schedule. Henry barely remembered most of those things. Helping Mrs. Chen fix her front steps took maybe an hour on a Saturday morning. Coaching Lily's soccer team was something any involved parent would do. Building wheelchair ramps for the community center was a weekend project with his crew, hardly worth mentioning. But someone had been paying attention. Someone had seen a pattern of service that Henry himself hadn't recognized, had documented acts of kindness he considered routine, and transformed them into evidence of exceptional character. The foundation requires only one thing in return: that you use this opportunity to continue being exactly who you are, a father, a community member, and a person who sees others in need and responds with compassion. There's no formal obligation, no required service hours, just an expectation that you'll keep doing what you've already been doing.
After the call ended, Henry sat in his kitchen surrounded by broken ceramic and tried to process what had just happened to his life. $150,000, a college degree, a future that extended beyond paycheck-to-paycheck survival and into the realm of actual opportunity. But underneath the overwhelming gratitude was a growing awareness that this wasn't random charity. The foundation's knowledge of his situation was too detailed, too precise. They knew about his work schedule, his daughter's school, his community activities, his financial struggles. They'd somehow obtained character references from people he barely thought twice about helping. Someone with extraordinary resources had been studying his life, documenting his actions, building a case for why he deserved this windfall. The same someone who'd been providing anonymous gifts for weeks, who understood his needs with uncanny accuracy. As Henry swept up the broken mug and prepared to call in sick to work, how could he frame walls when his entire world had just shifted? He found himself thinking about Brian Jordan, the lonely boy at graduation who'd lit up when someone simply chose to sit beside him. The child whose mother was supposedly too busy with board meetings to attend his graduation. A board meeting at a major technology company. A company with the resources to establish foundations and hire law firms and transform lives with a single phone call. The pieces were starting to come together in Henry's mind, forming a picture so improbable it seemed like fiction. But the money was real. The opportunities were real. And somewhere in Seattle, a 10-year-old boy with autism was probably still treasuring the memory of the day a stranger had cheered for him like he mattered. Henry had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to reveal the true identity of the most powerful woman in the Pacific Northwest, or that Brian's mother was about to face the most important choice of her career, whether success meant commanding boardrooms or learning to love the extraordinary child she'd somehow lost sight of along the way. The private investigator's office smelt like stale coffee and cigarettes, despite the no smoking sign prominently displayed on Detective Maria Santos's desk. Henry sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, feeling completely out of place as he explained his situation to the woman who came highly recommended by his union representative. "Let me get this straight," Maria said, reviewing the manila folder Henry had brought containing documentation of all the mysterious gifts. "In the past month, anonymous donors have given your family approximately $170,000 in direct financial assistance, plus educational opportunities and medical coverage, and you want me to find out who's behind it?" "I know it sounds crazy," Henry admitted, running his hands through his hair. "Most people would just take the money and run. But this isn't random charity, Detective Santos. Someone has been studying my life, documenting everything I do, building some kind of case for why I deserve help. I need to know who and why." Maria leaned back in her chair, studying Henry with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years investigating human behavior. "Mr. Gomez, I've been a private investigator for 2 decades. I've seen lottery winners, inheritance scams, long-lost relatives with guilty consciences, and elaborate con games. This doesn't fit any of those patterns. She opened his file and spread the documents across her desk. The scholarship letters, the foundation paperwork, the legal documentation from various law firms. What you're describing is a coordinated campaign by someone with serious resources and serious connections. The foundations listed here are legitimate, the law firms are reputable, the payment methods are all above board. Whoever's doing this has the infrastructure to move large amounts of money while maintaining complete anonymity. So you can find them? I can try, but I'm going to warn you. People who have this level of wealth and this commitment to privacy don't usually get exposed unless they want to be. The legal protections alone probably cost more than most people make in a year. Henry pulled out his checkbook, wincing at the irony of using his mysterious windfall to pay for an investigation into its source. I need to know. My daughter is asking questions I can't answer. And honestly, I can't accept this level of generosity without at least trying to thank whoever's responsible. Maria quoted her daily rate, and Henry wrote the check without hesitation. 3 weeks ago, $500 for a private investigator would have been impossible. Now it felt like pocket change, which somehow made the whole situation even more surreal. I'll start with the foundations, Maria said, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. The Pacific Northwest Working Families Foundation is supposedly new, but foundations don't just appear overnight with this kind of funding. Someone had to establish it, fund it, and set up the legal framework. That leaves a paper trail. For the next 5 days, Maria Santos embarked on what she later described as the most frustrating investigation of her career. Every lead she followed ended in carefully constructed dead ends. The Pacific Northwest Working Families Foundation was registered in Delaware with a law firm that specialized in anonymous charitable giving. The board of directors consisted of 3 names she couldn't verify, likely aliases or representatives. The Children's Health Security Initiative had similar protections. Registered through a different Delaware firm, funded through a series of shell companies that traced back to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The legal architecture was sophisticated, expensive, and absolutely impenetrable. Whoever set this up hired experts, the kind of experts that technology companies and hedge funds use when they want to move money without leaving fingerprints. We're talking about legal fees in the 6-figure range just to establish these protections. Henry's suspicions crystallized. Technology companies?
Among others. This level of financial sophistication suggests someone with experience in complex corporate structures, tech industry, finance, maybe pharmaceutical. Someone who understands how to navigate regulatory requirements while maintaining privacy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria's contact at the Seattle Business Journal mentioned a recent article about philanthropic initiatives by local tech leaders. There's been a trend toward anonymous giving among the tech billionaires, he explained over coffee. They want to help, but don't want the publicity that comes with traditional charity galas and naming rights. Maria pulled the article and found a photograph from a recent charity auction. Seattle's wealthiest citizens gathering to support various causes. In the background of one photo, she spotted something that made her pause. A woman in an elegant black dress, standing slightly apart from the crowd, her attention focused on her phone rather than the auction proceedings. The caption identified her as Victoria Sterling, CEO of North Star Technologies. North Star Technologies, Maria muttered, cross-referencing the name with her research. The company had been mentioned in several of the foundation documents, not as a contributor, but as a reference point for the type of technology solutions the foundations wanted to support. A deeper dive into Victoria Sterling's background revealed a pattern that made Maria's investigative instincts tingle. Sterling was notoriously private despite her public success, rarely granting interviews and never discussing her personal life. She'd built North Star Technologies from a startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire in less than 15 years, focusing primarily on medical technology and educational software. More importantly, Victoria Sterling was a single mother to a 10-year-old son with autism. Maria spent the next 2 days researching everything she could find about Brian Jordan Sterling. School records were sealed, but public information revealed that he attended Riverside Academy, the same school where Henry's daughter Lily was enrolled, the same school where graduation ceremonies were held 3 weeks ago. "Mr. Gomez," Maria said during their second meeting, sliding a photograph across her desk, "do you recognize this woman?" Henry studied the corporate headshot of Victoria Sterling. Intelligent eyes, perfectly styled blonde hair, the kind of composed expression that belonged in boardrooms and business magazines. "No, I don't think so. Should I?" "This is Victoria Sterling, CEO of North Star Technologies. Net worth approximately $3.2 billion. She has a 10-year-old son named Brian who attends Riverside Academy." The name hit Henry like a physical blow. Brian Jordan. His full name is Brian Jordan Sterling. He uses his middle name at school, probably for privacy reasons. Maria leaned forward. "Mr. Gomez, I think you've been anonymously supported by one of the wealthiest women in the Pacific Northwest. The question is, why?" Henry closed his eyes, remembering the lonely boy at graduation, the careful way he'd spoken about his mother's board meetings and important work. "Because I sat with her son at graduation. Because he was alone and I couldn't stand watching him graduate without anyone cheering for him." A moment of kindness toward her child inspired a billionaire to invest $170,000 in your family. Maria's skepticism was evident. "You don't understand," Henry said quietly. "That boy, Brian, he was so alone. He talked about his mother like she was a stranger who just happened to share his living space. He said she'd picked his father from a catalog like he was ordering office supplies. When I cheered for him at graduation, it was the first time I'd seen him really smile." Maria made notes, but her expression remained doubtful. "Mr. Gomez, people don't usually spend this kind of money on gratitude. There has to be more to it." But Henry was beginning to understand something Maria's investigative experience couldn't capture. Victoria Sterling wasn't paying him back for a kindness. She was paying him to continue being present for a son she didn't know how to reach. The carefully structured foundations, the educational opportunities, the long-term financial security weren't rewards for past actions. They were investments in future ones. "She doesn't want to thank me," Henry realized aloud. "She wants to hire me." The revelation should have felt exploitative, but instead it felt heartbreaking. Somewhere in a corporate tower, one of the most powerful women in America was using her vast resources to ensure that her autistic son would have at least one person in his life who saw him as more than a problem to be managed or a responsibility to be handled. "Detective Santos," Henry said, standing up from his chair, "I don't need you to find any more evidence. I know who's been helping my family, and I think I understand why. What are you going to do with the information?" Henry thought about Brian's face at graduation, the way the boy had lit up when discussing mathematical patterns in building design. He thought about Victoria Sterling's absence from that ceremony, and the complex web of anonymous generosity she'd constructed rather than simply showing up for her son. "I'm going to do what she's paying me to do," Henry said finally. "I'm going to be present for a kid who needs someone to see him for who he really is." As Henry left the investigator's office, he had no idea that Victoria Sterling was, at that very moment, sitting in her penthouse office, reviewing security footage from graduation day, watching the viral video of his kindness toward Brian, and preparing to take the biggest risk of her professional life, reaching out directly to the man who'd given her son something she'd been unable to provide with all her wealth and success.
The security alert that would shatter Victoria Sterling's carefully constructed world arrived at 2:17 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, interrupting a board meeting where she was presenting North Star Technologies' expansion into European markets. Her head of security, David Chen, sent a priority message to her encrypted phone. Urgent. Your son's name trending on social media. Viral video situation. Need immediate consultation. Victoria excused herself from the boardroom, her composed exterior betraying nothing of the ice-cold fear that had just flooded her system. In her private office, she closed the door and called David directly. "What kind of viral video?" she asked without preamble. "Ma'am, someone recorded Brian at his graduation ceremony. The video has been viewed over 18 million times across multiple platforms. It's actually quite positive, but given our privacy protocols, I thought you should see it immediately." Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the secure link David sent to her phone. The video quality was good, shot from several rows behind Brian's section of the auditorium. She could see her son clearly, sitting alone in his perfectly pressed navy suit, maintaining the rigid posture she'd spent thousands of dollars teaching him through behavioral therapy. Then she watched a stranger approach Brian's row, a man in a work shirt and khakis, moving with the confident stride of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be deterred. She watched him settle into the empty chair beside her son, watched Brian's careful posture begin to relax as they spoke. But it was the moment when Brian's name was called that destroyed her completely. The stranger, she could see now that he was clearly working class, his hands weathered from manual labor, leaped to his feet like Brian was his own child. His voice boomed across the auditorium. "That's my boy! Way to go, Brian!" The applause was thunderous, enthusiastic, completely unself-conscious. And Brian's face as he walked across the stage was radiant with joy. Victoria had to pause the video, her vision blurred by tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. In 18 million views, the world had seen her son experience something she'd never given him. Unconditional pride, enthusiastic celebration, the simple gift of someone being genuinely excited about his achievements. She forced herself to continue watching. The video captured Brian waving from the stage, a spontaneous gesture of connection that she'd never seen from her careful, controlled child. It showed him practically glowing as he returned to his seat, animated in a way that years of therapy and intervention had never achieved. The comments section was filled with reactions that made Victoria's chest tighten with shame and recognition. This is what every child deserves, someone who celebrates them unconditionally. My heart is breaking for this boy. Where is his family? That man is a hero for seeing a child who needed someone to care. Every kid with autism should have someone in their life like this dad. But the comment that shattered her was from a verified account. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric psychologist Victoria recognized from the autism specialist conferences she'd attended. "What you're witnessing here is therapeutic breakthrough in real time. This child's entire stress response shifts when someone shows genuine interest in him as a person rather than as a set of symptoms to manage." Victoria closed the video and sat in the silence of her corner office, 42 floors above Seattle, surrounded by the symbols of her success and forced to confront the magnitude of her failure as a mother. She'd missed Brian's graduation for a board meeting about quarterly projections. While 18 million strangers watched her son experience joy, she'd been debating market penetration strategies and revenue optimization. While a construction worker gave Brian the gift of feeling valued and celebrated, she'd been calculating profit margins and competitive advantages. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Sterling, your 3 p.m. appointment is here." Victoria realized she'd been sitting in her office for over an hour, staring at spreadsheets that quantified her guilt and video footage that demonstrated her inadequacy as a mother. She had investors waiting, product launches to review, a company to run, but for the first time in her professional life, none of it seemed to matter.
She thought about Brian, probably at his after-school tutoring session, working through social skills exercises with a therapist who charged $200 per hour. He'd never mentioned the graduation ceremony to her, never shared his excitement about the man who'd cheered for him. Their dinner conversations remained the same careful exchanges about school assignments and therapy progress. Meanwhile, Henry Gomez had become the subject of global conversation about kindness, inclusion, and the power of showing up for children who needed someone to care. The contrast was devastating. A billionaire CEO who couldn't connect with her own son, and a construction worker who'd instantly recognized and responded to that same child's need for acceptance. Victoria opened her laptop and began typing an email that would either be the smartest or most dangerous decision of her career. Mr. Gomez, my name is Victoria Sterling. I believe you know my son, Brian Jordan. I need to speak with you about something that affects both our families. Would you be willing to meet? Victoria. She stared at the message for 10 minutes before hitting send. In those 10 minutes, she calculated the risks: exposure of her carefully guarded privacy, potential media attention, the possibility that Henry might reject her overture, or worse, judge her for the choices that had led to this moment. But the image of Brian's radiant face as he waved from the graduation stage overrode every business instinct she'd developed. Her son had experienced joy because of Henry Gomez's kindness, and she'd been too absent to witness it herself. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling was about to ask for help with a problem that couldn't be solved with money, algorithms, or quarterly projections. She was about to face the man who'd given her son what she didn't even know he needed, and admit that despite all her success, she'd failed at the only job that truly mattered. The sent email sat in her outbox like a confession, and Victoria Sterling, CEO, billionaire, one of the most powerful women in technology, waited to discover whether the construction worker who'd saved her son might also be willing to save her. Henry stared at the email on his phone screen for the third time, reading and rereading the simple message that had arrived at 6:43 p.m. while he was helping Lily with her summer math homework. Victoria Sterling, the name he'd suspected but hadn't quite been ready to confront in reality. "Dad, you've been looking at your phone for 10 minutes. Is everything okay?" "Just work stuff, sweetheart," he said automatically, though his hands were trembling slightly as he set the phone aside. How do you explain to an 11-year-old that a billionaire CEO wants to meet because you were kind to her son? The coffee shop Victoria had suggested was neutral territory, a small place called Moonrise Cafe in the Capitol Hill district, far from both the corporate towers downtown and Henry's working-class neighborhood. When he arrived at 7 p.m. the following evening, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall like someone accustomed to maintaining sightlines and exit strategies. She looked smaller in person than in the corporate photographs he'd found online. Without the power suits and boardroom settings, Victoria Sterling appeared almost fragile. A woman in her early 40s wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Henry's monthly rent, but whose eyes carried a weariness that no amount of money could cure. "Mr. Gomez," she stood as he approached, extending a manicured hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know this must seem strange." "Strange is one word for it," Henry said, settling into the seat across from her. "Miss Sterling, I have to ask, was it you? All the anonymous gifts, the foundations, the scholarships—" Victoria's composure cracked slightly. "Yes, it was me." She paused, seeming to gather herself. "I want to explain why, but first I need you to understand something about Brian that you probably figured out during graduation." She pulled out her phone and showed him a video, security footage from what appeared to be their home. In it, Brian sat alone at a massive dining table, eating dinner while Victoria worked on a laptop at the other end. Neither spoke for the entire 10-minute clip. This is what dinner looks like at our house most nights. Brian finishes his meal in silence, clears his plate, goes to his room to do homework. I review quarterly reports and answer emails. We live in the same space, but we might as well be strangers. Henry watched the footage with growing discomfort. The house was clearly a mansion, the dining room larger than his entire apartment, but the emotional distance between mother and son was devastating to witness. "I don't understand how to connect with him," Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've hired the best therapists, enrolled him in every program, provided everything experts said he needed. But I can't bridge the gap between his world and mine. Every conversation feels like a business meeting where neither of us speaks the same language." She swiped to another video, this one from graduation day, the same footage that had gone viral. "Then I saw this. I watched a complete stranger accomplish in 20 minutes what I haven't been able to do in 10 years. You made my son smile. You made him feel valued and celebrated. You gave him something I didn't even know he needed." Henry stared at her face, seeing exhaustion and genuine pain beneath the polished exterior. "Miss Sterling, being kind to a child isn't some special skill. Brian just needed someone to see him as a person instead of a problem to solve."
"But that's exactly what I've been doing wrong," Victoria said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "I've spent Brian's entire life treating his autism like a software bug that needed debugging. I've approached parenting like a project management problem. Identify the issues, allocate resources, measure outcomes, optimize results." She pulled out a tablet and showed him spreadsheets tracking Brian's therapy appointments, behavioral goals, educational milestones. "Look at this. I've documented everything, analyzed every data point. I know exactly how many words he speaks per day, what sensory triggers to avoid, which therapeutic interventions show the most measurable progress. But I don't know what makes him laugh." The revelation was heartbreaking in its clinical precision. Henry could see years of well-intentioned effort that had somehow missed the fundamental point of parenthood, simply loving your child for who they are, rather than trying to optimize who they might become. "When I watched that video," Victoria continued, "I realized that in 20 minutes of conversation, you learned more about Brian's interests and personality than I've discovered in months of living with him. You talked to him about mathematical patterns in building design because you actually listened to what he was telling you about himself." "What did the therapists tell you about connecting with Brian?" Henry asked. Victoria's laugh was bitter. "They gave me strategies and techniques, structured interaction protocols, scripts for conversations, everything designed to help me manage his autism more effectively. But no one ever suggested that maybe I should just enjoy spending time with him." She scrolled through her phone to a calendar app showing Henry Brian's schedule. Every day was blocked out in 15-minute increments. Occupational therapy, speech therapy, social skills training, academic tutoring, sensory integration sessions. There wasn't a single entry that just said play or fun or hang out. "I've been treating Brian like a full-time job that I needed to excel at. I analyzed his needs, hired specialists, implemented evidence-based interventions. I approached autism like it was a technical challenge that could be solved through proper resource allocation and strategic planning." "And that's why you've been helping my family anonymously," Henry realized. "You weren't thanking me for being kind to Brian. You were hiring me to keep being present for him in ways you don't know how to be." Victoria nodded, tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. "I watched how naturally you connected with him, how easily you made him feel heard and valued. I realized that all my money and all my expertise couldn't buy what you gave him for free, genuine human connection. So you created an entire financial support system to ensure I'd stay in Brian's life." "I wanted to make sure you'd be available," Victoria said. I researched your situation, learned about your financial struggles, your work schedule, your daughter's needs. I thought if I could remove the economic pressures that kept you working double shifts, maybe you'd have time to keep being Brian's friend." The admission hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Henry found himself looking at Victoria Sterling with new eyes, not as a powerful CEO, but as a mother who'd lost her way and was desperately trying to find a path back to her son. "Miss Sterling," Henry said gently, "Brian doesn't need a project manager. He needs a mom who sees him as amazing exactly as he is. The boy I met at graduation is brilliant, funny, curious about the world. He doesn't need to be fixed or optimized. He just needs someone to appreciate his unique way of seeing things." "But I don't know how," Victoria whispered. "I've spent so many years focused on his deficits and challenges that I've forgotten to look for his strengths. When he talks about mathematical patterns, I hear autism symptom instead of brilliant insight. When he needs quiet time, I see social failure instead of sensory management." Henry thought about his own relationship with Lily, how natural it felt to celebrate her achievements and comfort her struggles without analyzing or strategizing. What if you stopped trying to manage Brian's autism and started just being curious about Brian as a person? What if instead of scheduling structured interactions, you just asked him to teach you about something he loves? Victoria stared at him like he'd suggested something revolutionary. "You think it could be that simple?" "I think Brian is probably desperate for his mom to see him as more than a therapeutic challenge. The boy I talked to at graduation was eager to share his interests with someone who would listen. He lit up when he could explain mathematical concepts and building design. He just wanted someone to be excited about the things that excite him." For the first time since they'd sat down, Victoria smiled, a small, tentative expression that transformed her entire face. "He does get excited about patterns and structures. I always thought it was, well, autism-related behavior that needed to be managed. Or maybe it's just Brian being Brian. Maybe instead of seeing autism symptoms, you could see a kid who's passionate about mathematics and engineering. Maybe instead of managing his interests, you could encourage them." Victoria pulled out her phone and began making notes, then stopped herself, laughing softly. "Look at me, already trying to turn this into a strategy document. This is exactly what you're talking about, isn't it? I can't even have a conversation about connecting with my son without trying to create an implementation plan." "Miss Sterling," Henry said, leaning back in his chair, "what if tonight, instead of reviewing quarterly reports during dinner, you asked Brian to explain something he learned today? Not because a therapist recommended it, but because you're genuinely curious about what's going on in his brilliant mind."
The suggestion was so simple, so obvious, that Victoria wondered how she'd missed it for 10 years. She'd been so focused on helping Brian navigate the world that she'd forgotten to let him show her how he saw it. The crisis that would test everything came 3 days after Victoria's coffee meeting with Henry. She was in her office reviewing the quarterly board presentation when her assistant burst through the door without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately signaled emergency. "Miss Sterling, Brian's school called. There's been an incident. They need you to come immediately." Victoria's blood turned to ice. "What kind of incident?" "They said he's safe, but won't come out of the supply closet. He's been there for 2 hours, and they can't get him to respond to anyone. Not the teachers, not the counselors, not even the autism specialist they brought in." The drive to Riverside Academy was a blur of racing thoughts and self-recrimination. Victoria had tried Henry's advice the night before, asking Brian about his day instead of reviewing her laptop during dinner, but the conversation had felt stilted, forced, like she was reading from a script she'd never properly learned. Brian had answered her questions politely, but briefly, before excusing himself to his room. Now he was hiding in a supply closet, and she had no idea why. The school's main office was chaos when she arrived. Principal Williams looked frazzled. The autism specialist, Dr. Rebecca Kim, was conferring with 2 teachers, and through the hallway, she could hear other students being directed away from whatever area Brian had barricaded himself in. "Miss Sterling, thank you for coming so quickly," Principal Williams said, rushing over. "Brian had what appears to be a sensory overload episode during lunch.
The cafeteria was particularly loud today. They were celebrating someone's birthday with singing, and he suddenly got up and ran out. We found him in the supply closet in the art room, but he's locked it from the inside and won't respond to anyone. Dr. Kim approached with her clipboard and professional sympathy. This is actually quite common with autistic children under stress. The best approach is to give him space and time to self-regulate. We've cleared the hallway and reduced stimulation, but it may take several more hours before he's ready to emerge. Several hours? Victoria's blood turned to ice. But he's just a 10-year-old boy. He's been alone in there for 2 hours already. Isn't there something we can do? Sometimes forced intervention can actually escalate the situation, Dr. Kim explained. Brian needs to feel safe and in control. When he's ready, he'll come out on his own. But as Victoria stood in the hallway listening to the absolute silence from behind the supply closet door, she realized that all the expert advice in the world meant nothing if her son was suffering alone. This was exactly what Henry had been talking about, treating Brian like a set of symptoms to manage, rather than a scared child who needed his mother. Has anyone tried just talking to him? Not trying to get him to come out, just talking. The teachers exchanged glances. We've attempted various de-escalation techniques, but children in this state typically need sensory reduction rather than additional input. Victoria felt a flash of anger at the clinical language. He's not in a state. He's scared and overwhelmed and hiding. She approached the supply closet door and sat down on the floor outside it, ignoring the looks from the educational professionals behind her. Brian, it's Mom. I'm not going to ask you to come out. I just wanted to sit here with you for a while. Silence from behind the door. The hallway is quiet now. They moved all the other students away. It's just you and me. She leaned back against the wall, making herself comfortable. You know what? I've been thinking about what you said at dinner yesterday, about how the school's architectural design follows a modified Fibonacci sequence. I looked it up after you went to bed, and you were absolutely right. A slight rustling sound from inside the closet. I never realized how much mathematics goes into building design. You see patterns everywhere, don't you? In buildings, in music, in the way numbers work together. I think that's amazing. More rustling, and then Brian's voice, small and muffled. You looked up Fibonacci sequences? I did. I spent an hour reading about them on Wikipedia. Did you know they appear in flower petals and pine cones too? Nature follows mathematical patterns just like buildings do. I know about the pine cones, Brian said, his voice slightly stronger. I have a collection in my room. They all follow the spiral pattern. Victoria's heart clenched. She'd walked past Brian's room hundreds of times and never noticed a pine cone collection. How much of her son's world had she missed while focusing on therapy schedules and educational goals? Would you show me your collection sometime? I'd love to learn about the patterns you've discovered. Really? You want to see them? Really? I want to understand the things you find interesting. There was a long pause, and then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened just a crack, and Brian peered out with red-rimmed eyes. Mom, can we go home now? The cafeteria was too loud, and everyone was looking at me when I left. Victoria's instinct was to launch into problem-solving mode, analyze what triggered the episode, discuss coping strategies, schedule additional sensory integration therapy. Instead, she took a breath and looked at her son's exhausted face. Of course we can go home, she said simply. Would you like to show me your pine cone collection when we get there? Brian nodded and opened the door wider. As Victoria stood up, she caught sight of Dr. Kim and the other professionals watching with expressions of mild surprise. They'd expected a longer intervention, more structured de-escalation techniques. Miss Sterling, Dr. Kim approached as they prepared to leave. We should probably schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss prevention strategies for future episodes. We'll call you, Victoria said, putting her arm gently around Brian's shoulders. For the first time, he didn't pull away. The drive home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet rather than the tense silence that usually filled their car.
Brian sat in the passenger seat. Usually he insisted on the back to avoid unwanted interaction, and occasionally pointed out architectural features of buildings they passed. "Mom," he said as they pulled into their driveway, "why did you sit on the floor at school? Dr. Kim always says standing maintains authority positioning." Victoria turned off the engine and looked at her son. "Because when someone you care about is scared, you sit with them. Authority positioning doesn't matter when your child needs you." Brian considered this with the serious expression he brought to all new information, like how Henry sat with me at graduation even though he didn't have to. Exactly like that. That evening, Victoria found herself sitting on Brian's bedroom floor examining his pinecone collection while he explained the mathematical principles governing their spiral patterns. His room was a revelation, walls covered with drawings of geometric patterns, shelves lined with books about architecture and engineering, models of famous buildings he'd constructed from Legos. "This is incredible, Brian," she said, genuinely amazed by the complexity of his interests and the depth of his knowledge. "How long have you been studying architectural design?" "Since I was 7, he said proudly. "I started with simple patterns and then discovered how they appear in real buildings. Want to see my drawings of the Space Needle? I calculated the engineering load-bearing requirements." As Brian showed her sketch after detailed sketch, Victoria realized that while she had been spending thousands of dollars on specialists to help him navigate the world, he'd been quietly building an extraordinary understanding of how the world was constructed. Her ultimate test hadn't been getting Brian out of the supply closet. It had been learning to see him clearly for the first time. The real work began the next morning, when Victoria did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She called in sick for work. Not for a medical emergency or family crisis, but because Brian asked if she wanted to visit the construction site where Henry was working to see real-world architectural principles in action. "Miss Sterling?" Her assistant Margaret's voice carried barely concealed panic through the phone. "The Goldman Sachs presentation is at 2 p.m. today. The board expects your quarterly projections, and the European expansion meeting has been scheduled for weeks." Victoria stood in her kitchen, making Brian's lunch, actually making it herself instead of having her housekeeper prepare it, and felt the familiar pull of professional obligation warring with something newer and more uncertain. "Reschedule the Goldman meeting for tomorrow. Push the board presentation to Thursday. The European expansion can wait until next week." "Ma'am, Mr. Davidson from the board specifically said—" "Margaret, I'm taking the day off to spend time with my son. Handle the rescheduling." Victoria hung up before her assistant could object further, her hands trembling slightly with the magnitude of what she had just done. Brian looked up from his precisely arranged lunch. "Are you sure you want to come to the construction site? You'll get your clothes dirty, and it's very loud." "I have work clothes, though I wasn't entirely sure what constituted appropriate construction site attire."
"Mrs. Sterling," Henry said, extending a dirt-stained hand, then thinking better of it. "Brian said you might stop by. Ready for the grand tour?" "Ready," Victoria said, though she felt anything but ready as she looked around at the organized chaos of a major construction project. Heavy machinery moved with purpose. Workers in hard hats carried materials and blueprints, and the air filled with sounds that made her grateful for the earplugs Brian had insisted she bring. What happened next was a revelation that would stay with Victoria for the rest of her life. As Henry led them through the site, pointing out structural elements and explaining construction techniques, Brian came alive in ways she'd never witnessed. He asked detailed questions about load-bearing calculations, made observations about design efficiency, and engaged in technical discussions that left Victoria struggling to follow. "Your son has an incredible eye for structural engineering," Henry told her, as they watched Brian examine the steel framework with intense concentration. "He spotted a potential stress point in the original blueprints that our engineer missed. Kid's got natural instincts for this work." Victoria watched Brian measure angles with his hands, calculating relationships between support beams with an intuitive understanding that would have impressed graduate engineering students.
This wasn't autism-related repetitive behavior or special interest fixation. This was genuine brilliance being applied to real-world problems. "Mom, look at this," Bryant called out, pointing to a section where two support structures intersected. "They're using triangular bracing patterns to distribute weight loads. It's the same principle as the Eiffel Tower, just on a smaller scale." For the next 3 hours, Victoria followed her son and Henry through the construction site, watching Brian demonstrate knowledge she'd never known he possessed and social engagement she'd never seen him display. He worked collaboratively with the construction crew, asked thoughtful questions, and offered insights that were taken seriously by experienced professionals. But the real test came when they returned home and Brian asked if they could spend the evening working on his sensory-friendly school design. Victoria's phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from her office. Urgent decisions needed, meetings to reschedule, crises that required her immediate attention. "Mom, you don't have to help if you're busy," Brian said, noticing her glancing at her phone. "I know your work is important." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. How many times had Brian offered her a chance to connect, only to watch her choose laptop screens and conference calls instead? How many opportunities for genuine relationship had she missed while prioritizing quarterly projections over quality time? "My work can wait," Victoria said, setting her phone aside and powering it off completely. "Show me your designs." Brian's face lit up with surprised joy. "Really? You want to see all of them?" "All of them. And I want you to explain how each design element would help children with sensory processing needs." The next 4 hours were simultaneously the most challenging and rewarding of Victoria's recent life. Brian's architectural concepts were sophisticated, incorporating elements of engineering, psychology, and educational theory that demonstrated a level of integrated thinking she rarely encountered even in corporate strategy sessions. But more than that, working with Brian required her to slow down, to listen carefully, to ask questions from genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. When he explained how certain lighting angles could reduce anxiety for autistic students, she had to resist the urge to immediately research market applications for therapeutic lighting technology. When he showed her acoustic design principles that would minimize overwhelming sounds, she fought the impulse to calculate revenue potential for noise reduction products. "This is really hard for you, isn't it?" Brian observed, as Victoria struggled to focus on his explanation of tactile-friendly building materials instead of checking her watch. "What do you mean?" "Just sitting here talking about ideas without trying to turn them into business plans. I can see you thinking about how to monetize everything I show you." The observation was so accurate and so gently delivered that Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. "You're right, Brian. I'm sorry. I'm not very good at just being present." "It's okay, Mom. Henry says learning new things takes practice. Maybe you just need to practice being curious instead of always being productive." That night, after Brian went to bed, Victoria sat in her home office surrounded by the architectural drawings they'd worked on together. Her laptop remained closed, her phone stayed silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't reviewing quarterly reports or preparing for the next day's meetings. Instead, she was thinking about her son's incredible mind, his natural empathy for other children with sensory challenges, his sophisticated understanding of how physical environments could support or hinder learning. And she was also confronting the uncomfortable reality that connecting with Brian required skills she'd never developed: patience, presence, and the ability to value process over outcome. Her phone buzzed with a text from Henry. "How did the construction site visit go? Brian seemed excited about showing you his world." Victoria typed back, "I'm learning that my son is extraordinary in ways I never bothered to notice. This is harder than running a corporation." Henry's response came quickly. The best things usually are, but you're already doing better than you think. Brian told me you turned off your phone for 4 hours tonight. That's probably the longest he's had your undivided attention in years.
The truth of that statement was devastating and motivating in equal measure. Victoria realized that learning to be Brian's mother, really learning, not just managing his needs, would require the same kind of sustained effort and commitment she'd brought to building North Star Technologies. But unlike every other challenge in her professional life, this one couldn't be delegated, optimized, or solved through strategic planning. It required her to show up, day after day, with patience and presence and genuine interest in understanding her son's remarkable mind. The commitment would be harder than any corporate merger, more demanding than any product launch, and more important than any business success she'd ever achieved. And for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling was ready to embrace a challenge that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or market share. The real work of becoming Brian's mother was just beginning. The real work began the next morning when Victoria did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She called in sick to work, not for a medical emergency or family crisis, but because Brian had asked if she wanted to visit the construction site where Henry was working to see real-world architectural principles in action. Miss Sterling, her assistant Margaret's voice carried barely concealed panic through the phone. The Goldman Sachs presentation is at 2 p.m. today. The board expects your quarterly projections, and the European expansion meeting has been scheduled for weeks. Victoria stood in her kitchen making Brian's lunch, actually making it herself instead of having their housekeeper prepare it, and felt the familiar pull of professional obligation warring with something newer and more uncertain. Reschedule the Goldman meeting for tomorrow, she said, watching Brian carefully arrange his sandwich in geometric patterns before eating it. Push the board presentation to Thursday. The European expansion can wait until next week. Ma'am, Mr. Davidson from the board specifically said, Margaret, I'm taking the day off to spend time with my son. Handle the rescheduling. Margaret hung up before her assistant could object further, her hands trembling slightly with the magnitude of what she'd just done. Brian looked up from his precisely arranged lunch. Are you sure you want to come to the construction site? You'll get your clothes dirty, and it's very loud. I have work clothes, Victoria said, though she wasn't entirely sure what constituted appropriate construction site attire. And I can handle loud. I want to see what you and Henry talk about. The drive to the medical complex where Henry's crew was working gave Victoria time to second-guess her decision approximately 47 times. She was the CEO of a $3 billion company. Her absence from critical meetings would raise questions from investors, create speculation in business journals, potentially impact stock prices. Everything in her professional life screamed that this was irresponsible, short-sighted, a dangerous precedent. But Brian's excitement as he pointed out architectural features of every building they passed made her press harder on the accelerator. Henry was surprised to see them when they arrived at the job site, but his face lit up with genuine pleasure as he noticed Victoria's attempt at work-appropriate clothing. Designer jeans that probably cost more than his weekly salary, but practical boots and a simple t-shirt that showed she had actually listened to Brian's warnings about getting dirty. Miss Sterling, Henry said, extending a dirt-stained hand, then thinking better of it. Brian said you might stop by. Ready for the grand tour? Ready, Victoria said, though she felt anything but ready as she looked around at the organized chaos of a major construction project. Heavy machinery moved with purpose, workers in hard hats carried materials and blueprints, and the air filled with sounds that made her grateful for the earplugs Brian had insisted she bring. What happened next was a revelation that would stay with Victoria for the rest of her life. As Henry led them through the site, pointing out structural elements and explaining construction techniques, Brian came alive in ways she'd never witnessed. He asked detailed questions about load-bearing calculations, made observations about design efficiency, and engaged in technical discussions that left Victoria struggling to follow. Your son has an incredible eye for structural engineering, he told her, as they watched Brian examine the steel framework with intense concentration. He spotted a potential stress point in the original blueprints that our engineer missed. Kid's got natural instincts for this work. Victoria watched Brian measure angles with his hands, calculating relationships between support beams with an intuitive understanding that would have impressed graduate engineering students. This wasn't autism-related repetitive behavior or special interest fixation. This was genuine brilliance being applied to real-world problems. "Mom, look at this," Brian called out, pointing to a section where two support structures intersected. "They're using triangular bracing patterns to distribute weight loads. It's the same principle as the Eiffel Tower, just on a smaller scale." For the next 3 hours, Victoria followed her son and Henry through the construction site, watching Brian demonstrate knowledge she'd never known he possessed and social engagement she'd never seen him display. He worked collaboratively with the construction crew, asked thoughtful questions, and offered insights that were taken seriously by experienced professionals. But the real test came when they returned home and Brian asked if they could spend the evening working on his sensory-friendly school design. Victoria's phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from her office. Urgent decisions needed, meetings to reschedule, crises that required her immediate attention. "Mom, you don't have to help if you're busy," Brian said, noticing her glancing at her phone. "I know your work is important." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. How many times had Brian offered her a chance to connect, only to watch her choose laptop screens and conference calls instead? How many opportunities for genuine relationship had she missed while prioritizing quarterly projections over quality time?
"My work can wait," Victoria said, setting her phone aside and powering it off completely. "Show me your designs." Brian's face lit up with surprised joy. "Really? You want to see all of them?" "All of them. And I want you to explain how each design element would help children with sensory processing needs." The next 4 hours were simultaneously the most challenging and rewarding of Victoria's recent life. Brian's architectural concepts were sophisticated, incorporating elements of engineering, psychology, and educational theory that demonstrated a level of integrated thinking she rarely encountered, even in corporate strategy sessions. But more than that, working with Brian required her to slow down, to listen carefully, to ask questions from genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. When he explained how certain lighting angles could reduce anxiety for autistic students, she had to resist the urge to immediately research market applications for therapeutic lighting technology. When he showed her acoustic design principles that would minimize overwhelming sounds, she fought the impulse to calculate revenue potential for noise reduction products. "This is really hard for you, isn't it, Brian?" observed as Victoria struggled to focus on his explanation of tactile-friendly building materials instead of checking her watch. "What do you mean?" "Just sitting here talking about ideas without trying to turn them into business plans. I can see you thinking about how to monetize everything I show you." The observation was so accurate and so gently delivered that Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. "You're right. I'm sorry, Brian. I'm not very good at just being present." "It's okay, Mom. Henry says learning new things takes practice. Maybe you just need to practice being curious instead of always being productive." That night, after Brian went to bed, Victoria sat in her home office surrounded by the architectural drawings they'd worked on together. Her laptop remained closed. Her phone stayed silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't reviewing quarterly reports or preparing for the next day's meetings. Instead, she was thinking about her son's incredible mind, his natural empathy for other children with sensory challenges, his sophisticated understanding of how physical environments could support or hinder learning. She was also confronting the uncomfortable reality that connecting with Brian required skills she'd never developed: patience, presence, the ability to value process over outcome. Her phone buzzed with a text from Henry. "How did the construction site visit go? Brian seemed excited about showing you his world." Victoria typed back, I'm learning that my son is extraordinary in ways I never bothered to notice. This is harder than running a corporation." Henry's response came quickly. "The best things usually are. But you're already doing better than you think. Brian told me you turned off your phone for 4 hours tonight. That's probably the longest he's had your undivided attention in years." The truth of that statement was devastating and motivating in equal measure. Victoria realized that learning to be Brian's mother, really learning, not just managing his needs, would require the same kind of sustained effort and commitment she'd brought to building North Star Technologies. But unlike every other challenge in her professional life, this one couldn't be delegated, optimized, or solved through strategic planning. It required her to show up, day after day, with patience and presence and genuine interest in understanding her son's remarkable mind. The commitment would be harder than any corporate merger, more demanding than any product launch, and more important than any business success she'd ever achieved. And for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling was ready to embrace a challenge that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or market share. The real work of becoming Brian's mother was just beginning. The real work began the next morning when Victoria did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She called in sick to work. Not for a medical emergency or family crisis, but because Brian had asked if she wanted to visit the construction site where Henry was working to see real-world architectural principles in action. "Miss Sterling," Margaret's voice carried barely concealed panic through the phone. "The Goldman Sachs presentation is at 2 p.m. today. The board expects your quarterly projections, and the European expansion meeting has been scheduled for weeks." Victoria stood in her kitchen, making Brian's lunch, actually making it herself instead of having her housekeeper prepare it, and felt the familiar pull of professional obligation warring with something newer and more uncertain. Reschedule the Goldman meeting for tomorrow. Push the board presentation to Thursday. The European expansion can wait until next week. "Ma'am, Mr. Davidson from the board specifically said," "Margaret, I'm taking the day off to spend time with my son. Handle the rescheduling." Victoria hung up before her assistant could object further, her hands trembling slightly with the magnitude of what she'd just done. Brian looked up from his precisely arranged lunch. "Are you sure you want to come to the construction site? You'll get your clothes dirty and it's very loud." "I have work clothes," though she wasn't entirely sure what constituted appropriate construction site attire, "and I can handle loud. I want to see what you and Henry talk about."
Henry was surprised to see them when they arrived at the job site, but his face lit up with genuine pleasure as he noticed Victoria's attempt at work-appropriate clothing, designer jeans that probably cost more than his weekly salary, but practical boots and a simple t-shirt that showed she'd actually listened to Brian's warnings about getting dirty. "Mrs. Sterling," Henry said, extending a dirt-stained hand, then thinking better of it. "Brian said you might stop by. Ready for the grand tour?" "Ready," Victoria said, though she felt anything but ready as she looked around at the organized chaos of a major construction project. Heavy machinery moved with purpose, workers in hard hats carried materials and blueprints, and the air filled with sounds that made her grateful for the earplugs Brian had insisted she bring. What happened next was a revelation that would stay with Victoria for the rest of her life. As Henry led them through the site, pointing out structural elements and explaining construction techniques, Brian came alive in ways she'd never witnessed. He asked detailed questions about load-bearing calculations, made observations about design efficiency, and engaged in technical discussions that left Victoria struggling to follow. "Your son has an incredible eye for structural engineering," Henry told her as they watched Brian examine the steel framework with intense concentration. "He spotted a potential stress point in the original blueprints that our engineer missed. Kid's got natural instincts for this work." Victoria watched Brian measure angles with his hands, calculating relationships between support beams with an intuitive understanding that would have impressed graduate engineering students. This wasn't autism-related repetitive behavior or special interest fixation. This was genuine brilliance being applied to real-world problems. "Mom, look at this," Brian called out, pointing to a section where two support structures intersected. They're using triangular bracing patterns to distribute weight loads. It's the same principle as the Eiffel Tower, just on a smaller scale. For the next 3 hours, Victoria followed her son and Henry through the construction site, watching Brian demonstrate knowledge she'd never known he possessed, and social engagement she'd never seen him display. He worked collaboratively with the construction crew, asked thoughtful questions, and offered insights that were taken seriously by experienced professionals. But the real test came when they returned home and Brian asked if they could spend the evening working on his sensory-friendly school design. Victoria's phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from her office, urgent decisions needed, meetings to reschedule, crises that required her immediate attention. "Mom, you don't have to help if you're busy," Brian said, noticing her glancing at her phone. "I know your work is important." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. How many times had Brian offered her a chance to connect, only to watch her choose laptop screens and conference calls instead? How many opportunities for genuine relationship had she missed while prioritizing quarterly projections over quality time? "My work can wait," Victoria said, setting her phone aside and powering it off completely. "Show me your designs." Brian's face lit up with surprised joy. "Really? You want to see all of them?" "All of them. And I want you to explain how each design element would help children with sensory processing needs." The next 4 hours were simultaneously the most challenging and rewarding of Victoria's recent life. Brian's architectural concepts were sophisticated, incorporating elements of engineering, psychology, and educational theory that demonstrated a level of integrated thinking she rarely encountered even in corporate strategy sessions. But more than that, working with Brian required her to slow down, to listen carefully, to ask questions from genuine curiosity rather than professional obligation. When he explained how certain lighting angles could reduce anxiety for autistic students, she had to resist the urge to immediately research market applications for therapeutic lighting technology. When he showed her acoustic design principles that would minimize overwhelming sounds, she fought the impulse to calculate revenue potential for noise reduction products. "This is really hard for you, isn't it?" Brian observed, as Victoria struggled to focus on his explanation of tactile-friendly building materials instead of checking her watch. "What do you mean?" "Just sitting here talking about ideas without trying to turn them into business plans. I can see you thinking about how to monetize everything I show you." The observation was so accurate and so gently delivered that Victoria felt her eyes fill with tears. "You're right. I'm sorry, Brian. I'm not very good at just being present." "It's okay, Mom. Henry says learning new things takes practice. Maybe you just need to practice being curious instead of always being productive." That night, after Brian went to bed, Victoria sat in her home office surrounded by the architectural drawings they'd worked on together. Her laptop remained closed. Her phone stayed silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't reviewing quarterly reports or preparing for the next day's meetings.
Her phone buzzed with a text from Henry. "How did the construction site visit go? Brian seemed excited about showing you his world." Victoria typed back, "I'm learning that my son is extraordinary in ways I never bothered to notice. This is harder than running a corporation." Henry's response came quickly. "The best things usually are, but you're already doing better than you think. Brian told me you turned off your phone for 4 hours tonight. That's probably the longest he's had your undivided attention in years." The truth of that statement was devastating and motivating in equal measure. Victoria realized that learning to be Brian's mother, really learning, not just managing his needs, would require the same kind of sustained effort and commitment she'd brought to building North Star Technologies. But unlike every other challenge in her professional life,
This one couldn't be delegated, optimized, or solved through strategic planning. It required her to show up day after day with patience and presence and genuine interest in understanding her son's remarkable mind. The commitment would be harder than any corporate merger, more demanding than any product launch, and more important than any business success she'd ever achieved. And for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Sterling was ready to embrace a challenge that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or market share. The real work of becoming Brian's mother was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.